Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of Veterinary Wednesdays, where we focus on all things vet from general health to animal disease. On this week's episode, we visit a property in Armadale with a peculiar case affecting sheep. Reports describe sheep as wobbling, violently staggering and swaying, and experts are saying this may be a dangerous outbreak. We have the farmer on the line right now. Let's see what she has to say. G'day, Maureen.
Hi, John.
So can you tell us a bit more about what you saw and what the sheep are doing?
About 100 of the sheep were rubbing and scratching themselves against any fixed objects they contacted. And I noticed about 50 of my sheep trembling violently. They were wobbling and staggering and swaying everywhere. And then to top it off, I saw that 2 sheep were bunny hopping and another 4 sheep were high stepping. So I called the district vet, Dr. Zupa, and he took over from there, which was a relief.
So we actually have Dr. Zuper on the line from Armadale Rural Lands Protection Boards. We've just been talking to Maureen. What can you tell us about this?
It is a most unusual case. I attended to it as soon as the client called. After having a look at the sheep, we performed 5 post-mortem examinations. Intense itchiness can be caused by ectoparasite infections. For sheep that are walking funny and have seizures, these are suggestive of brain diseases, particularly the forebrain and the cerebellum. We can broadly categorize the possible causes into 3 groups: infectious, metabolic, and toxic. Some common causes are shown in this list here.
Can you tell us a bit more about Scrapie and how would you confirm the diagnosis?
Scrapie is a progressive neurodegenerative disease of adult sheep and goats. It has a really long incubation period, so Maureen's 6 sheep would actually have been infected between 2 and 5 years ago. To be able to possibly diagnose it, we need to very carefully remove the brains, cerebellum, and a section of the spinal cord from each dead sheep. The brains were fixed in formalin, while the cerebellum and spinal cord were chilled until they were ready to be sent off to the state veterinary diagnostic laboratory, along with our post-mortem reports. My diligent vet interns helped me with all of this. This is all required to be eligible for Australia's National Transmissible Spongiform Encephalopathies Surveillance Program.
What's the significance of this national SpongeBob program?
Not SpongeBob, Spongiform. Well, it's a program that surveys bovine spongiform encephalopathies, also known as mad cow disease, in cattle and Scrapie in sheep in Australia.
So if Australia doesn't have Scrapie, then how can these sheep have it?
These sheep could have been infected by either an association with affected imported animals or if they've been infected from introduced biological products. It's very resistant to inactivation and is therefore really hard to eradicate.
We'll now be bringing in our representative from Animal Health Australia to tell us a bit more about this surveillance program. Welcome, Janine.
So basically, the National TSC Surveillance Program consists of both general surveillance activities as well as more targeted strategies to follow up on sheep showing neurological signs consistent with Scrapie. It's a joint effort between the governments and industry and consists of representatives from livestock industries, the Australian government, and state and territory animal health agencies. General surveillance activities include things like inspection of animals at abattoirs pre and post slaughter, inspecting animals at sale yards, and field investigations by government and private veterinarians wherever sheep are showing signs that may be suspicious of Scrapie. It also includes laboratory testing and thorough follow-up on cases of animals exhibiting unexplained neurological signs. Having these strategies in place enables us to be constantly on the lookout for any sign that TSE might have entered an Australian herd. Any incidences of sheep showing neurological signs consistent with Scrapie should be thoroughly investigated, as we want to keep Australia free from TSEs and prevent possible outbreaks. Post-mortems should be conducted on the affected animals on the property, and brain samples should be submitted to a lab for TSE testing. It is important that the integrity of the brain tissue remains intact for sample collections, so I'd recommend that IV injection of barbiturates is the best way to euthanize animals to make sure the brain is still intact, but also dispose of the carcasses appropriately. Brain and spinal cord samples are the most important for ruling out TSE, but a range of tissue samples should be collected in order to support a full laboratory investigation. Vets play an important role in keeping Australia TSE free. The National TSE Surveillance Program currently requires that 450 samples from eligible sheep to be submitted each year in order to prove that Australia is still TSE free. So by conducting these postmortems and taking appropriate samples, the interns can rest easy knowing that they are taking the right steps to ensure Scrapie outbreaks are being appropriately monitored for. My last piece of advice would be to tell our veterinary interns, as always, to contact their district veterinarian or the emergency animal disease hotline in order to notify them of any incidents like this in the future.
I now welcome Dr. Spice from the State Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, Rador Labs.
Because the sheep are scratching themselves, we can see some skin lesions secondary to self-trauma on their bodies as shown in these pictures. However, these lesions are quite non-specific and we usually don't see any gross changes to the brain, so we need to dig a little deeper and look at our histopathological findings, which are mostly confined to the central nervous system. While the most prominent features of Scrapie include neuronal vacuolation, neuronal loss and degeneration, and astrocytosis, the vacuoles do not pick up any staining and are predominantly intraneural and usually found within the nuclei in the thalamus, midbrain, pons and medulla. So now that we know what Scrapie looks like histologically, we can rule out some other diseases that we mentioned earlier. As opposed to polyencephalomalacia and most toxic causes, swelling and softening of the brain parenchyma is not observed in Scrapie, and unlike most infectious and metabolic causes, the cerebral cortex is rarely affected. An absence of inflammatory and infiltration may also help rule out the involvement of infectious agents. Well, upon combining our non-specific histopathological findings and ruling out other neurodegenerative diseases along with the detection of prion proteins via immunohistochemistry, I was able to confirm a Scrapie diagnosis.
So thank you very much for your help, Dr. Spice. We head back to Dr. Zuper. How do these findings help us?
Well, Dr. Spice's investigations confirmed a Scrapie diagnosis. Scrapie is a notifiable disease in Australia and Category 3 emergency animal disease, and this is therefore a very serious case. Unfortunately, there's no treatment or vaccines, and the disease is inevitably fatal. Luckily, it doesn't spread very quickly, so I had a bit of time to decide on how to proceed properly. Firstly, we implemented a total management plan. This helps focus our actions on risk animals and helps maximise the efficiency of the eradication programs. We then put into place some quarantine and movement controls of animals, products, and other potentially infected items to minimise the spread of the disease. Unfortunately, Maureen's property has been placed in immediate individual quarantine, which means that movement of any of her animals is subject to permit and depends on a risk assessment done by a veterinarian. We've made a risk assessment plan so that more detailed eradication planning decisions can be implemented. In the meantime, we've also started tracing and surveillance to determine the source and extent of the infection. Because of its long incubation period, the disease could be widespread by now, so we need to make sure other properties and places aren't infected as well.
And what about the sick sheep?
Unfortunately, we had to immediately slaughter and safely dispose by incineration of all the clinically affected sheep as well as the high-risk sheep such as the exposed and equivalent risk sheep. And to finish off, we are currently conducting an awareness campaign to facilitate cooperation from the industry as well as the community.
How long does this whole control plan last for?
Unfortunately, the control plan will last quite a long time due to the long incubation period of Scrapie.
Thanks, Dr. Zuper. We've got Janine back from the AHA to talk to us about the consequences of this diagnosis. Welcome back, Janine.
Well, Scrapie is a serious disease, and early detection is absolutely key, as eradication is only successful and cost-effective if detected within 10 years of entry. Luckily for us, we are well within those time limits. Well, eradicating Scrapie is very time and cost-intensive. Economics of detecting, controlling and eradicating Scrapie include everything from income losses from increased sheep mortalities and decreased productivity and costs of government control measures such as destruction and disposal of animals. The total cost is estimated to be between $4.7 million and $83 million, depending on if Scrapie was allowed to spread uncontrolled or not.
That is a crazy amount of money.
That's not all. The presence of the disease will lead to national and international disruption to trade, which is the main reason for economic loss. Our main export countries are likely to place a ban on the export of sheep and beef meat for a number of months, depending on the severity of the outbreak. The bans will result in sheep and beef meat products being diverted to the domestic market, as the meat is still safe for human consumption. This would lead to oversupply of meat products and prices would drastically decrease, leading to a loss of financial return for the producers. Outbreaks such as these definitely impact people's mental health and there is reduced welfare. The community definitely needs to be resilient.
Does Maureen get any kind of compensation?
Yeah, under the National TSC Surveillance Program, Maureen will receive $100 for the sheep samples for a maximum of 2 sheep. Dr. Zuper will also be compensated to cover the costs of laboratory fees and help pay for the freight of sending samples.
Well, folks, we hope you enjoyed this week's segment of Veterinary Wednesdays. Next week, we look at different methods of toenail trimming in alpacas.